Hello GCSE PE people, this is Mr. Moore and I've just started a brand new podcast where we're going to be doing some flipped learning. Now flipped learning is a type of teaching where essentially I set the content ahead of time, you guys watch it and then we discuss it in a lesson. It's as simple as that. Now you're probably wondering what this kind of setup is, so I'll just talk you through things. What we've got here is a digital light board, or it's also known as a learning glass. Here is some glass, and as you can see it's pretty cool. If I run my finger down, we've got some LEDs that go through the glass and they essentially just light up the reading so you can read it. And then what I do is I've got a camera that flips that round, so although it looks like I'm actually writing back to front and I'm super talented, I'm not that talented at all. The camera does all the work for me. So what we do is I set you this to do at home. And I'm going to do a series of podcasts on all things to do with GCSE PE. I'm going to set them for you to do them at home, which means that you can pause me, you can rewind me, you can fast forward me, you can do all of these cool things. And you'll have access to teaching 24/7, not to me, but to the videos that I make. Then what happens is when you get back into school, you arrive at the lesson already knowing what we're about to do. So how cool is that? You get to basically learn ahead of time and you come in and then we'll start the lesson here talking about what you did at home. So that is what we call flipped learning. I'm really interested in flipped learning. I've done quite a lot of research on it and I'm going to share some of that research to help you learn digitally. So we're going to be starting a new topic today which is called sports psychology. Now, sports psychology is all about understanding the athlete's mind. And at GCSE PE, we start with something called skill classification. And there are three types of skills you need to know about. The first one is open or closed skill. Now, these are pretty simple. Essentially, what an open skill does is it's a skill that's affected by the environment. So this one is affected by environment, whereas a closed skill is one that is self-paced and it is not affected by environment. So it's the opposite to the open skill. This one's affected by the environment, this one's not affected by the environment. So when we're talking about skills, it's important that we understand a definition, okay, before we do the classification. So a skill is the ability to perform something well. And you'll all know that in sort of sporting context, the better that we can perform a skill, the more able we are. So on this continuum, sports psychology, we call this a continuum, which is a continuous long line. And we've got opposite ends. At one end we've got open, and the other end we've got closed. And then you can be anything in between. So when we talk sports psychology, quite often we'll come across these things that we call continuums. So let's talk a little bit example-wise. What I'd like you to do is pause the podcast right now. So just pause the podcast and write down 3 examples from the world of sport that you can think about where the skills are open, and then write 3 examples where the skills are closed. So pause it now. Welcome back. So hopefully you would have thought of an environment where there's a lot going on. So potentially the environment itself could influence it. So it might be wet and windy, or you may have thought of the skill. So a really good example for an open skill is something like football dribbling, where the centre forward is coming towards the goalkeeper. And what would happen is they're running with the ball at their feet. They're thinking about where the defenders are. They're thinking about where the goalkeeper is, where their own players are. So there's a lot of different elements that can affect that skill, therefore making it very open in interpretation to other things acting on it. Whereas an example of a closed skill might be something like darts or snooker or shooting or archery, where potentially it's indoors, it's not in an outside environment, and there's very little that can affect the outcome of that skill. So it tends to be very controlled and not open to the external factors like the open skill is. But we could take something like a rugby conversion. We might put that here, halfway between the open and the closed skill. Now the reason we've done that is it has elements of a closed skill in that you're preparing to take a kick and you can self-pace it, decide when you want to do it. But also there's an element of open. You've got the opponent standing by the post, the referee telling you to get on with it, the crowd potentially. So something like a rugby conversion would probably sit somewhere between an open and a closed skill. The next type of skills we're going to talk about on our continuum are complex and simple. So a skill can be defined by how difficult it is. Now obviously some skills in sports are far more complex than others, and some are quite simple. So we take a simple skill like running, jumping. They're things that we're used to doing growing up. It's something that comes quite natural to us, and there's not many elements to it, so therefore it's quite a simplistic skill. Whereas a complex skill could be something like a tennis serve, where there's quite a lot of constituent parts that are more complex, and we need to break that skill down. So it's difficult to speak about this without introducing something called subroutines and motor programs. And these are two really important key words that I'm just going to talk through. So first of all, a subroutine, if you think of it as a number of small constituent parts of a skill. So if we took the tennis serve as our example, the subroutine would be the skill broken down into 5 subroutines. So with a tennis serve, the first thing that you do is you bounce the ball on the line. So that's the first part of the skill. Then what you do is you transfer your momentum from the back foot to the front foot. So that's the second part of the skill. Then you start to do the toss-up, which is when you throw the ball up in the air, ready to hit. That's that part, the third part. Then you make contact with it, which is the fourth part, and eventually you have a follow-through where your momentum is going beyond the service line. So we've got 5 constituent parts, and when we break it down into what's called a subroutine. And it might be at the elite level that you've got a problem with your toss-up, which is subroutine part 3, and a coach could then work on that and break it down. So what we've got here is a really complex skill, because we're able to break it down into constituent parts, which we call subroutines or motor programs. If we can work out where the faulty process is, we can fix it, but essentially complex skills are more difficult to work on than simple skills. So this is when the performer normally has to process a lot going on. So there's quite a few different components of the subroutine, and they've got to take that all on board, and that can be potentially quite confusing. It could also be in quite a challenging environment. So it could be where it's quite a challenging environment. Maybe there's multiple opponents or quite a complex environment surrounding them, a lot going on, and that potentially can make the skill more complex. On the opposite end of the spectrum, a simple skill is there's less parts. So for a simple skill, there's less parts, there's less that can go wrong, therefore it's more simplistic in nature, and it's easier to perform. So examples for simple skills, we've already talked about running. Maybe just kicking a penalty from a static position is quite a simple skill. There isn't too much that can go wrong. Whereas a complex skill, we tend to talk about a golf swing, a tennis serve, something that consists of numerous subroutines and motor programs. So this word subroutine and this word motor programs, they are key words in GCSE that you need to get your head around, and the examiner will really appreciate if you write about that and award you lots of marks. So in the final part of this video, we're going to explore high organisation skills and low organisation skills. So again, we've got a continuum, we've got opposite ends of the spectrum, we've got everything in between. So we'll start with the high organisation skills. These tend to be high organisation because they're complex due to the number of phases involved in them. And because the phases are so close together, it's really difficult to break them down and practice them in sort of isolation. And a great example of this would be cycling. If you took a Tour de France cycler, you'd put them at the high organisation stage because it's really difficult to stop cycling sort of mid-stride and or mid-cycle, should I say, and break it down into constituent parts. So that tends to be what we call a high organisation skill. Whereas a low organisation skill is slightly easier to isolate. You can break the specific phases down, and you can practice it, or you can fix it if it's slightly broken. And I'm going to use gymnastics tumbling as a floor routine as an example here. And you might think that's a bit weird, but a tumbling routine is essentially made of 3 or 4, or maybe 5 or 6 different skills. And the nice thing about a tumbling routine is you can break down any part of that and you can reorganize this sort of subroutine if it's broken, if it's faulty, and the motor programs, and you can fix it. When athletes get to kind of the top of the pyramid and they become a little bit more elite, they tend to have this amazing thing called kinesthesis, which is when they feel a movement either works or doesn't work. We're going to look at kinesthesis in the next podcast, which is looking at different types of practice, but it's essentially feeling the skill and knowing that the feel of that skill feels good. So for example, quite often you'll take a shot in football, and when it leaves your foot, you just know that it's destined for the top corner. Often in basketball, you'll take a three-pointer and you can just feel when it leaves the hand whether it's going to go in or not. And that is this wonderful word that's down the bottom, and we're going to explore that in a future podcast.